The House just approved over $1.2 trillion in government spending, and most people only saw the headline. Maybe you scrolled past it on social media. Maybe you caught a 30-second news segment that made it sound routine. Just another spending bill, just Congress doing what Congress does. But buried inside this vote were major funding decisions for healthcare, housing, transportation, and border enforcement. Decisions that will affect millions of Americans over the next several months. Decisions about which programs get protected, which agencies get expanded, and which controversial policies move forward despite public opposition. Plus, there was a controversial amendment that was meant to block funding for a rule some people fear could eventually allow the government to shut off your car remotely. A rule that sounds like science fiction but is actually written into federal law right now. And that amendment? It failed. So, today, let's break down what actually passed, what almost changed, and what this means for you. Because some of the most important parts of this vote barely got attention. The media focused on the top-line number and the political drama, but the details, the specifics of where this money is going and what it's funding, those details matter more than the headlines. On January 22nd, 2026, the House of Representatives passed the final set of spending bills needed to keep the government funded through September 30th and avoid a shutdown at the end of the month. This wasn't a last-minute scramble. This was planned. This was the culmination of weeks of negotiations, backroom deals, and political maneuvering. Instead of one giant omnibus bill that would have been thousands of pages long, lawmakers voted on two separate packages. One package passed with broad bipartisan support, with both Democrats and Republicans voting yes in significant numbers. The other package passed narrowly, squeaking through with just enough votes, and it split Democrats right down the middle. Together, these two packages make up the last pieces of the federal budget for fiscal year 2026. Everything Congress needs to fund the government through the end of September is now included in these bills. The big number? Altogether, this package totals approximately $1.2 trillion in discretionary spending. That's separate from mandatory spending on programs like Social Security and Medicare, which continue automatically under existing law. This $1.2 trillion is what Congress has to actively appropriate each year. Now let's break down where that money actually went, because the distribution tells you a lot about congressional priorities. The largest share by far went to the Pentagon. Defense spending totals about $839 billion. That's more than two-thirds of this entire package. To put that in perspective, that's more money than the next 7 or 8 categories combined. What does that $839 billion cover? It includes a 4.5% military pay raise for service members, which is actually larger than the raises most federal civilian employees are receiving this year. It includes funding for major weapons systems currently in development or production, things like the F-35 fighter jet program, which continues to be one of the most expensive military projects in history. It includes shipbuilding contracts for the Navy, which is trying to maintain and expand the fleet size to counter threats from China in the Pacific. It includes missile defense systems, both domestic and international, including continued support for Israel's Iron Dome and other allied defense programs. It includes increased money for training and readiness, making sure units are prepared for deployment. And it includes ongoing military operations around the world, from the Middle East to Eastern Europe to the Indo-Pacific region. Supporters of this level of defense spending, primarily Republicans but also many Democrats, say this is necessary for national security. They argue that global threats are increasing, that China is expanding its military rapidly, that Russia remains aggressive, and that terrorist organizations continue to pose risks. They say maintaining military superiority requires sustained investment. Critics, particularly progressive Democrats, argue that defense spending continues to grow year after year, while domestic programs face tighter limits or outright cuts. They point out that the United States already spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. They question whether every dollar of Pentagon spending is actually making Americans safer or just enriching defense contractors. But defense spending, despite being the largest line item, wasn't the most controversial part of this vote. That distinction belongs to something else entirely, which we'll get to in a moment. The House also funded health, education, and labor programs at approximately $195 billion. This covers a wide range of programs that most Americans interact with directly, even if they don't realize it. This money supports the National Institutes of Health, which is the primary federal agency conducting and funding medical research. NIH actually received an increase in this package, which is notable because many other health agencies saw their budgets remain flat or get cut. The increase for NIH means more funding for cancer research, Alzheimer's research, rare disease research, and pandemic preparedness. It includes funding for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, which monitors infectious diseases, tracks health trends, and responds to outbreaks. Early drafts of this spending package included deep cuts to the CDC, cuts that would have eliminated certain programs and reduced the agency's ability to respond to health emergencies. Those cuts were ultimately rejected, and CDC funding was largely maintained. The package includes funding for mental health services across the country, including community mental health centers, suicide prevention programs, and mental health crisis response teams. It includes opioid treatment and prevention programs, which remain critical as overdose deaths continue to claim tens of thousands of lives each year. On the education side, the package includes child care assistance programs that help low-income families afford care so parents can work. It includes funding for education programs at all levels, from early childhood education through college. Pell Grants, which help low- and middle-income students afford college, were maintained and slightly increased. One key detail here that deserves emphasis: this package rejected major cuts that were previously proposed for public health agencies. Earlier versions of these bills included significant reductions to CDC, NIH, and other health programs. Those cuts would have meant fewer researchers, smaller programs, and reduced capacity to respond to health threats. The fact that those cuts were reversed helped this bill gain broader support and ultimately pass. But that doesn't mean everyone was happy with the final numbers. Some progressives wanted even more for education and health. Some conservatives wanted less overall spending. But the compromise held, which is why the bill passed. Still, health and education funding wasn't the biggest fight of the day. That was yet to come. Transportation and housing programs were funded at approximately $113 billion. This is one of those categories that sounds boring and technical until you realize how much of daily life depends on these programs functioning properly. This covers air traffic control and Federal Aviation Administration operations. Every single flight that takes off and lands safely in the United States relies on FAA systems and personnel. Underfunding the FAA means longer delays, fewer safety inspections, and increased risk of accidents. It covers highways, transit systems, and rail infrastructure. Federal funding helps states maintain roads, build new transit lines, and keep Amtrak running. Without this money, infrastructure projects stall, roads deteriorate faster, and public transportation systems struggle to maintain service. It covers housing assistance programs that millions of Americans depend on. This includes Section 8 rental assistance, which helps low-income families afford housing in the private market. It includes public housing funding for maintenance and operations. It includes housing specifically designed for older adults and people with disabilities. These programs don't just help individuals, they keep housing markets stable by ensuring demand doesn't completely collapse in economic downturns. They reduce homelessness by providing rental assistance before people end up on the streets. They help people remain in their communities even when their incomes are limited. Were these programs funded at the levels advocates wanted? No. Housing advocates have been saying for years that federal housing assistance needs to be dramatically expanded to meet actual need. Only about 1 in 4 eligible households actually receives federal housing assistance due to funding limitations. But the programs survived, they weren't gutted, and for the people who depend on them, that matters enormously. Still, transportation and housing weren't the main source of political tension in this vote. That came with the next category, and it's where things got genuinely heated. The Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Bill passed 220 to 207. That was one of the closest votes of the entire year. Most Democrats voted against it. Only a handful crossed party lines to vote yes, providing just enough votes for passage. Why was this vote so close? Why did it split Democrats so dramatically? The answer comes down to one agency within DHS, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE. The bill kept ICE funding roughly flat instead of cutting it. Under normal circumstances, maintaining an agency's funding level wouldn't be controversial, but these aren't normal circumstances. ICE has been under intense scrutiny, particularly after a fatal shooting of a U.S. citizen in Minneapolis that sparked widespread outrage and calls for accountability. Democratic leaders, including senior members who typically support compromise funding bills, said this bill lacked strong enough accountability measures. They argued it did not add enough restrictions on enforcement activities. They said it failed to include the kind of tough oversight provisions they wanted to see in the wake of that shooting and other controversial enforcement actions. Progressive Democrats were even more forceful. They wanted significant cuts to ICE funding. They wanted strict limits on detention. They wanted provisions that would have fundamentally changed how immigration enforcement operates. And they didn't get those things. Even some senior Democrats who helped negotiate the broader funding package, people who are known for working across the aisle and finding middle ground, voted no on this specific bill. That tells you how seriously they viewed this issue. So why did this bill pass at all? Why didn't Democrats just vote it down? Republican leaders argued that keeping DHS funded was necessary to avoid chaos, especially with a shutdown deadline rapidly approaching. They said that cutting or defunding ICE would disrupt not just immigration enforcement, but basic DHS operations that have nothing to do with immigration, things like cybersecurity, disaster response, and Coast Guard operations. They argued that without DHS funding, the entire department would shut down, affecting far more than just ICE. And they used the shutdown threat as leverage to get just enough Democratic votes to pass the bill. Democratic leadership saw it very differently. They argued the bill did not include enough accountability after recent enforcement actions. They said it missed a critical opportunity to impose stronger limits on ICE's authority and funding, and they were frustrated that Republicans refused to include the oversight provisions they had requested. What made this vote particularly unusual is that some Democrats broke with their party and voted yes anyway, despite pressure from leadership and progressive activists. Those members, mostly moderates representing swing districts, said they were trying to prevent a government shutdown that would hurt their constituents. They said they were trying to keep funding stable for other DHS agencies that do important work. They said they were trying to avoid disruptions to essential services like disaster relief and border protection that have broad public support. At the same time, even some Democrats who helped negotiate the overall spending deal and who are known as deal makers still voted no on DHS to signal their strong disagreement with how ICE funding was handled. So this wasn't a simple party line vote. It was a complex mix of policy disagreement, political pressure, and difficult strategic choices about whether opposing the bill was worth risking a shutdown. Here's the part that often gets missed in the political coverage. The DHS bill was not a blank check for ICE. It actually included several provisions designed to add oversight and limit certain activities. It included $20 million specifically designated for body cameras for ICE agents. Body cameras create accountability by recording interactions between agents and individuals. They protect both agents from false accusations and individuals from misconduct. It included reductions in enforcement and detention funding compared to earlier drafts. The final numbers were lower than what Republicans initially proposed, reflecting Democratic concerns about detention practices. It included new reporting requirements on how DHS spends its money. The department will have to provide more detailed information to Congress about where funds are going and how programs are being implemented. It even included cuts to funding for the DHS Secretary's office, a symbolic but meaningful gesture showing that Congress wasn't just rubber stamping everything the department requested. Republicans pointed to these provisions and argued this was a reasonable compromise. They said the bill funds the agency while adding meaningful oversight. Democrats, or at least most Democrats, said it still didn't go far enough. They wanted deeper cuts, stronger restrictions, and more aggressive accountability measures. That fundamental disagreement is why DHS was voted on separately from the rest of the spending package. Leadership knew it couldn't pass as part of a larger bill because too many Democrats would vote no on the entire package. So they split it out, forced a separate vote, and narrowly got it across the finish line. Now let's talk about the amendment that caused the most confusion online and generated massive attention on social media. Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky, a libertarian-leaning Republican known for opposing government overreach, introduced an amendment that would have blocked federal funding from being used to carry out a specific vehicle safety rule that's already written into federal law. That rule comes from the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, a massive bipartisan bill that passed during the Biden administration. Buried deep within that 1,000-page law is a provision that requires the Department of Transportation to develop standards for advanced impaired driving prevention technology. The stated purpose of this requirement is to prevent drunk driving. The idea is that cars would be equipped with sensors or systems that could detect when a driver is impaired and prevent the vehicle from operating. Supporters say this technology could save thousands of lives each year by stopping drunk drivers before they even get on the road. But critics, including Representative Massie and many privacy advocates, warn that this technology could act like a government kill switch for cars. They're concerned that once this technology exists, it could be expanded beyond drunk driving detection. They worry it could be used for other forms of enforcement, data collection, or even remote shutdowns by police. The concerns aren't entirely theoretical. Critics point to several potential problems. What if the sensors produce false positives? What if a completely sober driver is prevented from operating their vehicle because the system malfunctions? Who controls the technology? Is it the car manufacturer, the government, or some combination? What about data privacy? If your car is constantly monitoring whether you're impaired, what other data is it collecting? Where does that data go? Who can access it? And perhaps most importantly, how could this rule expand in the future? Once the infrastructure exists to remotely prevent a car from operating, what stops that capability from being used for other purposes? Could it be used to enforce unpaid tickets? Could it be used to prevent people from traveling to certain areas? Could it be weaponized? The House voted on Massie's amendment, which would have prohibited any federal funds from being used to implement or enforce this rule. The amendment failed. It did not pass. Let me be very clear about what that means, because there's been a lot of confusion and misinformation spreading online. The House did not vote to create a new power to shut off cars. That power, or at least the framework for developing it, already exists in the 2021 law. What the House voted on was whether to block funding for developing the standards required by that law. The House voted not to block that funding. That means the Department of Transportation can continue working on these impaired driving prevention standards. The rule itself still has to go through additional regulatory steps. There will be public comment periods. There will be technical reviews. The final standards haven't been written yet. But the funding remains in place. The regulatory process continues, and that's why this issue isn't going away. Privacy advocates, libertarians, and civil liberties groups are going to keep fighting this at every stage. Supporters of the technology will continue arguing it's necessary to save lives. Opponents will continue warning about government overreach and privacy violations. This debate is far from settled. A few other things were folded into this spending package that barely got any media attention but matter quite a bit. The House repealed a law that allowed certain senators to sue the government over January 6th phone record seizures. This was a narrow technical provision that most people never heard about, but it was important to the senators affected by those seizures. The package extended several programs that were set to expire, including the National Flood Insurance Program. Without that extension, millions of homeowners in flood-prone areas would have been unable to get federally backed flood insurance, which would have frozen real estate markets in those regions. It completed all 12 required appropriations bills for the year. This might sound bureaucratic, but it's actually significant. Congress is supposed to pass 12 separate spending bills each year to fund different parts of government. They rarely do it on time. They usually end up passing continuing resolutions that just maintain previous funding levels. But this time, they actually did their job and passed all 12 bills. None of these things grabbed headlines. None of them went viral on social media, but all of them mattered to specific groups of people whose lives are affected by these programs. Even though the House passed this package, it's not final yet. It's not law. The Senate still has to approve it, and that's not guaranteed. If the Senate does not pass this funding package, or if senators make changes that the House doesn't accept, we're back to square one. The government could shut down. That shutdown deadline is at the end of January, just days away. Without a deal in place, funding would lapse. Federal agencies would begin shutting down non-essential operations. Hundreds of thousands of federal employees would be furloughed or forced to work without pay. Services would be disrupted. National parks would close. Some benefit payments could be delayed. That's why this House vote happened now, under pressure. Lawmakers are trying desperately to avoid a shutdown, to prevent furloughs, and to keep services running. This package is their path to doing that. But the Senate has its own dynamics, its own priorities, and its own political pressures. Some senators are already saying they want changes. Some are threatening to vote no unless specific provisions are added or removed. And with such narrow margins in Congress, every vote matters. So while the House vote was a major step forward, the clock is still ticking. The deadline is approaching. And until both chambers pass identical bills and the president signs them, the threat of a shutdown remains very real. This vote wasn't just about spending. It was about more than just keeping the government open for another few months. It showed which programs Congress chose to protect and which programs they were willing to cut or constrain. It showed where lawmakers are genuinely divided, not just along party lines, but within parties. The DHS vote split Democrats in ways that will affect future negotiations and political dynamics. It showed how controversial ideas can survive quietly when amendments fail. The car shutoff rule moves forward because the effort to defund it failed. That's how policy often gets made in Washington, not through high-profile debates, but through failed attempts to stop things. And it showed how much policy can be decided through funding rather than through headlines. Most people will never read these spending bills, but the decisions embedded in them will shape their lives for months to come. So what actually happened? The government stays open through September. Health and housing programs continue operating at roughly current levels. Defense spending rises to historic highs. ICE funding survives despite strong Democratic opposition. And debates over technology, privacy, and government authority remain unresolved and will continue into the future. When you look at everything that passed and everything that almost changed, here's the question you have to ask yourself. Do you feel like this spending package actually reflects what everyday Americans need right now? Or does it feel like Washington is still arguing over the same priorities, still favoring defense over domestic programs, still passing massive bills that most people don't understand, while the real financial pressure on American families keeps building? Because that's ultimately what matters, not whether Congress avoided a shutdown this month, but whether the spending decisions they make actually improve people's lives or just maintain a status quo that isn't working for millions of Americans. Of